Scripture reading for today is Matthew 15:31 through 45. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory, and all the nations will be gathered before him. And he will separate people from one another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep on his right hand, and the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right hand, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundations of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly, I say to you, just as you did it to one of these least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me." Then he will say to those on his left hand, "You are cursed. Depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me, naked, and you did not give me clothing, sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they will answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly, I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me."
On the front of your paper is a reflection box. In that you did it to the least of these, so you have done it to me. And every time I do this, I print up the size text bigger, and this podium still gets farther away. In this text, there's a lot of apocalyptic stuff. There's a lot of judgmental stuff. I want to leave it alone. I don't think it's our purview, and I think there's other places to go. But it does, in some Bible translations, it prefaces this section, this gospel text, with judgment of the nations, and we let it go easily. But I'm forced to think, who makes up the nations? This is speaking to us. It begins with the Son of Man speaking. That's Jesus. But by verse 34, Jesus is telling this story and presents a king. And scholars are all over the place on that leap of who is who in this. I'm going to leave that alone too. Where I want to go is about goats and sheep. Being called a goat, we'll work on that. Being called a sheep probably isn't polite. I just discovered this last summer during the Olympics the term goat. I had to ask, and Vivian and I had to ask my boy, "What's this about?" He said, "Oh, greatest of all time." I had never heard that expression. Simone Biles had this little medallion that she kept holding up. What's this about? My boy Matthew helped me out. But being called a sheep, you got to grit your teeth because it's not polite. Jesus calls us sheep, probably not polite. But in the first century, the hearer of this story had an eye view that I think is worth examining. Goats and sheep were herded together because goats are vigilant and sheep are just sheep. But then the hearer of that first century also heard this separation of the goats and sheep. They understood it because depending on the time of the year, it was an everyday event. Because sheep are upholstered. They can sit out in the cold, they can get wet, the lanolin in their fur just sheds the water out. Goats are short-haired. They may work up and down as the season changes, but when the dew falls on them, they get wet, they get cold, they're up all night eating, and they never get ahead. So goats have to have some sort of shelter. So this idea of separating the goats and the sheep under a covering of something was understood. But they were herded together for purposes of defense also. Vivian and I kept goats and sheep and cows for most of the 30 years we lived out in the country west of Kuna. I'm a city kid. I never had any critters before, so it was a real education. But if you look out your window and you see 4 or 5 of your goats all looking in the same place, all lined up together by the fence, their ears up, their tails down, you got a coyote out there someplace, and the sheep have no clue. But the truth is, and where the story is going, that Jim just read, goats are devious and sheep are oblivious. Now, we kept a number of different kinds of goats. The most common we had were alpines, and alpines look like you threw a bunch of cans of paint at them, and because they're just all blotchy. Toggenburgs are cinnamon colored, they got little skunk stripes on their face. And Nubians have kind of an arched nose, and they're grumpy. They got big, long ears, and they complain about the management all the time. Too hot, too cold, not enough feed, too much feed, let me out of here. There's also in the valley here, Saanens and Lamanches. Saanens are white, and Lamanches have no ears, and they look like a cauliflower ear on a prize fighter. We never kept them because I thought they were ugly. Let me tell you some stories about how devious goats can be. We had hog wire in the main corrals and electric fence wire around the smaller corrals out into the field. And we would manage them and pen them up at night, sometimes let them out, depends on the time of the year. But if we had just a single wire, it was about 12 inches off the ground. And we had this one alpine. She was the matriarch of the herd. We'd had her for 12 or 15 years, and she wasn't little when we got her. But she would get out, and I never figured out how. She would just get out. And one day I'm out in the backyard, and here she is. She's got her nose right down to that electric wire. Well, what are you doing? So I just got there next to her, and they don't care what you're doing. They're about what they're doing. And so I'm about this far from her, and she keeps getting closer and closer to that fence wire. Well, we had in the barn one of these buzzer devices for electrifying the fence. It wasn't a snapper. It would buzz for 2 or 3 or 4 seconds, and then it would stop for 5, 6, 7, 8 seconds. This goat is checking out the wire, and she's getting closer and closer, until finally I could see the fur on her nose wiggle, and she backed up. That's devious. That's smart, but it's really devious. We had a goat that figured out that if you're in flight over the wire, you don't get zapped. And I used to put out the wire when we were irrigating, because if the critters were out in the field in the corrugates, they would beat it down, and then if I had to recorrugate, it would tear up the field for the rest of the summer. But this goat figured out, in flight, you don't get zapped. Until one time, coming back in that doughy ground, she lost her footing and fell on the wire. So now, the wire's on the ground, in the water, she's not getting zapped. She tries to stand up, her knees go up. So now she's yelling at me, carried on, I'm bailing you out, you got a lesson to learn. She finally got herself off because she worked out the timing of the buzzer. That's devious. Goats demand attention. You can be walking out in the field. First thing when you walk out in the field is they look at you and they say, "What are you doing in my world?" But then they'll walk along with you, and they'll follow you. And then when they've had enough of that, they'll actually take 2 or 3 fast steps and turn in front of you, demand your attention. So you scratch them, sidestep them, walk around, and they'll do it again, as far out in the field as you go. They're demanding attention. When you go in a corral, we used to stake them out and tie them off up on the ditches to eat down the ditch for a day. You can go out there with a tether, and you don't have to, you just walk out there, and the one you're going for already knows it. They're mind readers. All the others are standing there. "Oh, he's not coming for me." But the one that knows that you're coming, it's off to the rodeo. Let's talk about sheep. I mentioned the kinds of goats. Well, there's probably 50 different kinds of sheep, and I don't have any of that memorized. We just had the white ones. But I'm convinced that sheep are a species that existed or came into being after Noah's Ark. Because if Noah had a pair of them and one of them got up on the main deck, it would have jumped over the side. And the other one would have followed it, and they'd be lost as a species. So they came later. One year when my boy was 6 or 7, it was late in the day, it was in the summer, it had been hot that day, and a little breeze came up, it had cooled down. I said, "Matthew, go on out in the field. I haven't seen those sheep in a couple of days. Walk out in the field there, go on down, I bet they're down at the bottom of the field under the hay wagon." So off he goes. He knew how to get into the corrals and stuff without getting zapped, and he's walking along down a long, narrow pasture. And as he's going, this is a 6-year-old, 5, 6-year-old, 7-year-old. "Oh, look, here's a stick." Got to pick it up. So as he's walking along, every fence post has to get a whack. Farther down the field, he finally sees the sheep, but about the same time, "Oh, here's a yellow sweet clover tumbleweed. Oh, we got to kick that along for a while." When you're dealing with a 6-year-old, you can't be in a hurry. Finally gets down to the bottom of the field. Sure enough, they're under the hay wagon. He pushes them out, and they're walking up the field, and he's poking them with a stick, and they trot up a little bit. And then they get around the corner where the corral turns into the main corral where the water tank is, and these sheep break into a dead run for that water. They had forgotten to come up for water. It's not polite being called a sheep. But let's listen to the response that Jim read, and let's deal with the goats first, remembering the goats are devious. And the king says, "I was hungry, and you did not feed me. I was thirsty, and you did not give me water." And the response to the goats, "When did I see you hungry? When did I see you thirsty?" Remembering goats are devious, what the goats are really saying is, oh yeah, prove it. When we get to the sheep, because sheep have only been out there doing what sheep do, it's an honest reply. When, Lord, did we see you? When did we see you hungry? When did we see you thirsty? When did we see you in prison? We've been doing all these things. It's an honest reply. All of this speaks to compassion. And Matthew 6 is all about compassion. Jesus, in the conversation with the Canaanite woman, she comes to him with an ailing daughter. Jesus at first doesn't hear. And the disciples said, Jesus, this lady's pestering us. She's wearing us down. Finally, Jesus deals with her, and she says, even the dogs eat from the crumbs under the table. And Jesus acts with compassion. The story of the Good Samaritan, a foreigner, a hated person, does the right thing when all the other people in that story pass by on the other side of the road. The hated one acts with compassion. Jesus heals on the Sabbath. Pretty big no-no. Then we have the story of the woman at the well. A bigger no-no. A woman, a foreigner, a harlot. Jesus acts with compassion. We're called to act with compassion because I would submit that compassion is the key to the kingdom here and now. There's a quiet humility here at Hyde Park. People doing what's right. People acting with compassion. But then we got to add one more piece. And Roger, this is not a shot at your thing for tomorrow at the BSU. We're called to act for today. We hear stories where the birds of the field neither sow or reap or store, or the flowers arrayed in their beauty neither labor or toil. So we're called to live for today and what's important, what's the call for compassion today. If we think about tomorrow, we're paralyzing ourselves for today. So the question is, what's in front of us today? Well, for now, it's the crop walk, where we stand and walk and donate and act with compassion. We ask the question, where did we see you hungry and homeless and thirsty, Lord? We act with compassion. We're called to act with that compassion and do the same. So, fellow sheep, the pasture is right out that door.